Jehovah's Witnesses have a long history of predicting the end of the world.
The accomplished end of this world system will come.
First, they predicted the return of Christ in 1874 and 1914.
The world, which to many seems out of control, is soon nearing its end.
Our brothers expected the return of Christ first for 1844 and then for 1914. There were serious testings during the year 1925 also.
Before 1975, before 1925, before any of the dates that would come to define the Watchtower's turbulent history, there was 1914. Charles Taze Russell, the founder of the movement, had spent years building a timeline from biblical mathematics. He was meticulous, passionate, and utterly convinced. Using a combination of prophetic calculations rooted in the Book of Daniel, Russell and his followers landed on 1914 as the year everything would change. The Gentile nations would fall, Christ's kingdom would be established, the waiting would be over. Members gave their lives to this belief. They preached it on street corners and in living rooms. They printed it in pamphlets that traveled across oceans. They built communities around the certainty of this single year. And when 1914 arrived, the atmosphere inside the Bible student movement was electric with anticipation. Then the calendar kept turning. January gave way to spring, spring became summer, and then something unexpected did happen in 1914, but not what anyone had prophesied. The world didn't end, instead it erupted into the most devastating war humanity had ever seen. The guns of August roared across Europe, trenches were carved into the earth, empires began to crack. But human governments were still standing, there was no earthly paradise, the promised transformation had not come. The silence inside the movement was deafening. For any organization built on prophetic certainty, this was an existential moment. Russell had to face his followers. He had to face the question that no leader ever wants to answer. What do you say to millions of people when the date you gave them passes without the promised miracle? Russell's answer was bold, creative, and impossible to disprove. He declared that Jesus had returned in 1914, just not in a way human eyes could see. According to this revised teaching, Christ had taken his heavenly throne invisibly. The war raging across Europe wasn't the end. It was the sign that the last days had officially begun. The physical end was still coming, and it was coming very soon. The genius of an invisible event is that it can never be refuted. You cannot photograph the absence of something. You cannot measure what no human eye can witness. The failure was repackaged as invisible victory, and for those whose faith needed an anchor, this explanation held. But it held only temporarily. Because in 1916, Charles Taze Russell died on a train in Texas, leaving behind a movement that had already survived one failed prediction and was about to be handed to a man with far more ambition and far less caution. Joseph Franklin Rutherford was not a man who spoke softly. A former lawyer and judge, he took control of the Watchtower Society in 1917 with the energy of someone who had something to prove. Where Russell had been a quiet visionary, Rutherford was a thunderclap. He understood that movements die when they lose momentum, and he was determined that this one would not die on his watch. By 1920, he launched what may be the most audacious prophetic campaign in the organization's history. Its slogan was simple, arresting, and impossible to misunderstand. Millions now living will never die. He put it in a booklet, he printed it by the millions, he sent speakers across the world to deliver it from stages and pulpits, and then he went further than slogans, he went to specifics. According to Rutherford's timeline, 1925 was not merely a symbolic threshold. In 1925, the ancient patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, men dead for thousands of years, would be physically resurrected and would walk the earth again as visible rulers of a new divine order. This was not poetry, this was not metaphor, Rutherford wrote it down as fact. And people believed him. They had already been trained by one generation of prophetic certainty. They had already reorganized their lives once around a date. They did it again. Preachers fanned out into neighborhoods and towns, delivering the message with trembling urgency. The year was circled on the calendar. The world was going to change. 1925 arrived, it left. Abraham did not appear. No ancient patriarchs walked the streets. No divine government materialized from heaven. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the organization had experienced in 1914 because this time Rutherford had been explicit. He had named names, he had promised faces. Later, with notable understatement, Rutherford admitted he had made a mistake. But the story of 1925 did not end with that admission. It ended with something that would become one of the most bizarre chapters in the organization's history, a mansion in California built for men who would never arrive. In 1929, With the Great Depression grinding millions of Americans into poverty, the Watchtower Society spent significant funds constructing a large, comfortable Spanish-style mansion on a hilltop in San Diego, California. They named it Beit Sarim, House of the Princes. The property deed was unlike anything ever recorded in American real estate history. The document stated that the mansion was held in trust for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and other ancient biblical figures, on the formal expectation that they would be resurrected and would need a place to live and govern. Let that settle in for a moment, a legal deed held in trust for men who had been dead for thousands of years. While the world waited for these ancient princes to appear, someone else moved into Beit Sarim's 10 rooms. Joseph Rutherford himself took up residence there each winter. He drove a luxury automobile, he enjoyed the California sun, and he did so during a period when millions of Americans were standing in bread lines and losing everything they owned. The optics were, to put it charitably, complicated. Rutherford died at Beit Sarim in 1942. 6 years later, the organization quietly sold the property, explaining only that maintaining it was no longer necessary. The mansion was gone. The failed 1925 prophecy was quietly buried beneath decades of new publications and new expectations. But the cycle was not over, it was only gathering speed. By the mid-1960s, a new generation of Jehovah's Witnesses had grown up inside the organization. Most of them had no living memory of 1914 or 1925. They knew those stories only as historical footnotes, sincere mistakes made by imperfect men in a simpler era. The organization was larger now, more professional, more polished in its publications and its presentations. And then, in 1966, a book dropped into congregations around the world. Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God contained a timeline built around a single calculation. If Adam was created in autumn of 4026 BCE, and if you counted exactly 6,000 years forward, you arrived at autumn of 1975. The book presented this as the potential close of 6,000 years of human existence, the threshold before a divinely ordained millennium of peace. The pressure inside congregations began to build. By July 1968, Awake magazine was pointing directly at 1975, stating that Armageddon could arrive within months, not years. Assembly speeches carried the message with electric urgency. Circuit overseers stood before crowds of hundreds and spoke about 1975 as if it were already visible on the horizon, as if they could almost see the first clouds of the final storm gathering. The leadership never published a single official guarantee. They were careful enough to use language like "it appears" and "it seems reasonable." But in the halls and meeting rooms among families gathered for study, the message was received with absolute clarity. The end, this is it. This is where the story stops being about theology and starts being about people. Real people, families, young people with their whole lives ahead of them. In May 1974, an official organizational newsletter called Kingdom Ministry published something extraordinary. It commended members who were selling their homes and liquidating their assets in order to spend whatever time remained on earth in full-time preaching work. Read that sentence again. The organization was praising people for selling their homes because the world was ending. Couples delayed having children, reasoning there was no point bringing a baby into a world that would be transformed within months. Young people who might have pursued medicine, law, engineering, or science were encouraged instead to avoid higher education. After all, why spend 4 years studying for a career in a system that wouldn't exist by the time they graduated? Others sold businesses they had spent lifetimes building. Some postponed critical medical procedures. Elderly members spent their savings on preaching materials rather than retirement security. The urgency was not manufactured by the members. It was handed down from above, drip by drip, speech by speech, article by article. And then 1975 arrived. The autumn passed without incident. October came, October left, November arrived cold and unremarkable, December followed. The world turned into 1976 and the sun kept rising and human governments kept standing and paradise did not begin. For hundreds of thousands of members worldwide, the silence of 1976 was catastrophic. People who had sold their homes had nothing to return to. Young people who had skipped university now faced a job market with no qualifications. Couples who had delayed starting families watched that window closing. The psychological devastation was immeasurable. Marriages collapsed, families fractured. People who had shaped their entire adult lives around a single year found themselves standing in the rubble of decisions they could not undo. Between 1976 and 1978, approximately 300,000 members left the organization. 300,000 people. That number is not a statistic. It is 300,000 individual stories of shattered faith, broken trust, and the unbearable weight of having believed completely in something that failed completely. In the immediate aftermath, the organizational response was measured and strategic. Early articles suggested that members themselves had developed wrong expectations. The language was careful, sympathetic in tone, but pointed in direction. The implication was clear: believers had gotten too excited. They had read too much into suggestions that were never meant to be taken as guarantees. The fault lay with the audience, not the speaker. But as the membership hemorrhage continued, and the anger inside congregations grew too loud to ignore, the tone changed. In March of 1980, the Watchtower published something the organization had almost never done before: a direct acknowledgement. The leadership admitted that they had contributed to building up expectations around 1975. They asked members to forgive and to move forward. It was a significant moment, but it was also a damage control moment, and everyone watching knew it. To stabilize those who remained, the governing body redirected attention back to their foundational date of 1914 and to the doctrine built around it. Jesus had stated in Matthew 24:34 that the generation alive during these last days would not pass away before the end came. Leadership had long taught that this referred specifically to people who were alive and aware of the events of 1914. In the 1970s, that generation was aging. In the 1980s, they were elderly. By the early 1990s, the last survivors who had living memories of 1914 were dying of old age. Biology was doing what failed prophecy could not. It was setting a hard deadline that no theological adjustment could comfortably move. In November 1995, the Watchtower Society did something that stunned even longtime members. They changed the definition of generation. After decades of stating clearly that this generation referred to people alive in 1914, the organization announced that the word now referred to a class of people defined by their spiritual character, not their birth year. With a single doctrinal adjustment, the ticking biological clock was disarmed. The masthead of Awake magazine, which had carried the promise that the magazine existed to build confidence before the generation that saw the events of 1914 passes away, was quietly revised. The words disappeared, years of institutional commitment erased in a single editorial decision. For thousands of members, this was the breaking point. They had stayed after 1975. They had stayed through the slow fade of 1925. They had rationalized and explained and defended, but this felt different. This felt like watching the rules change mid-game by the same people who had written the rules. The new doctrine proposed that this generation mentioned by Jesus was not one group of people, but two overlapping groups of anointed believers. Group 1 had seen 1914 firsthand. Group 2 had been anointed while Group 1 was still alive. Because their lives overlapped, they constituted together a single extended generation. By combining the lifespans of two groups of people, the mathematical timeline for Armageddon was pushed decades further into the future. Critics immediately recognized the structural problem. A doctrine designed to give believers an imminent deadline had been engineered to have no deadline at all. You could, in theory, continue overlapping generations indefinitely. A Group 3 whose lives overlapped with Group 2, a Group 4, the horizon kept retreating. To loyal members, this was new light, progressive revelation, God illuminating truth in stages as he had always done. To the hundreds of thousands who had already left, and to the millions watching from the outside, it looked like something else entirely. More than a century has passed since 1914. The dates have shifted. The definitions have been rewritten. The timelines have stretched and bent to accommodate every biological and mathematical inconvenience. And millions of people still wait, sincerely and faithfully, convinced that the end is closer now than it has ever been before. But the history is there. It does not disappear when the pages are turned. 300,000 people walked away after 1975 carrying wounds that never fully healed. Families lost decades of educational and financial opportunity to dates that turned out to mean nothing. Young people made irreversible decisions based on information handed to them by an authority they had every reason to trust. The organization calls its failed predictions sincere miscalculations, imperfect men doing their best to read divine truth through human eyes, and perhaps that is true. Perhaps it is the most charitable and accurate framing available. But sincerity does not rebuild a souled home. Good intentions do not return the years spent not in university. An apology in a magazine does not reconstitute the family savings spent on preaching work in 1974. When an authority holds absolute doctrinal power over millions of lives, when it shapes decisions about careers and families and medical care and futures, the cost of being wrong is not abstract. It is measured in the specific weight of specific losses borne by specific human beings who believed what they were told. The clock is still running. The next deadline is forming somewhere in the pages being written right now, and the only question that matters is the one history keeps asking quietly, relentlessly, with every year that passes. What happens when it arrives?
Considerable expectation was aroused regarding the year 1975. Unfortunately, however, says the Watchtower, along with such cautionary information, there were other statements published that imply that such realization of hopes by that year was more of a probability than a mere possibility. It is to be regretted, admits the Watchtower,